Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Fifth Avenue Synagogue Sunday Speaker Series. And at various times in world history, it appears that the world and the Jewish people just go from one crisis to another. There has been a pandemic occurring over these past 2 years. A war has broken out in Eastern Europe, and which has the potential to bring or to threaten world stability. And while this is all going on without much attention, very little media coverage, the issue of Iran attaining a nuclear weapon has once again been a matter of grave concern. Tonight, we have the opportunity to hear from Malcolm Hoenlein, Executive Vice Chairman and CEO of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. His topic this evening is the Iran deal a sellout for America and Israel's interests? Malcolm was meant to be formally introduced by Ronald Lauder, but he's not yet joined, but I'm sure he'll give a proper introduction when Ron joins us a little bit later.
So Malcolm, you've spoken in the show many times in person. I think this is our first Zoom together. Now we're living in the new COVID world. So thank you for this evening. And I wanted to start the discussion. You have been a big advocate in the Jewish world. I would say if there's anyone that's done a lot for the Klal, you would be on the top of that category. So I wanted to know, you've been doing this for decades. The Soviet Union, we're going to talk about Iran and the Ukraine and a bunch of things this evening, but I'd like to know, or if you could share with the crowd, what really inspired you to do what you do, to really, be such an activist for the Jewish people?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, and Rabbi, thank you. I've been a longtime fan and had an association with Fifth Avenue Synagogue for, I think, as long as I was when I came to New York for Soviet Jewry. It was one of my first stops, and that was more than 50 years ago. So it's a long relationship. I will tell you honestly that it wasn't my choice, that my whole life was geared towards this. I never looked for a job in my life. Everything happened to me, but I do know that the Shoah was a decisive influence. My grandparents on all sides were killed, many other relatives. I remember when the notices came that they did not make the cutoff when they got papers to come, and my parents, who came alone, each of them, to the United States, worked very hard to get them here. And I decided as a very young child that Jews could not live at the sufferance of others, that we had to determine our own fate. And to do that, we had to have control of our fate, meaning getting involved politically, meaning having the clout, not necessarily to determine the outcome, but to try to influence it, that we would have the ability to mobilize the support that we needed. And the real test came with Soviet Jewry, when I think that was the implementation of Never Again, that when we marched and demonstrated, we showed that we learned the lessons, that there would no longer be a period where Jews would be alone. Elie Wiesel titled his book on Soviet Jewry, The Jews of Silence. They were Jews who were kept silent. American Jews were the Jews of silence. And we broke that with Soviet Jewry, with the fight for Syrian Jewry and Iranian Jewry and Iraqi Jewry and Yemeni Jewry. And I was privileged to have played a role in all of those. That this, I think, is the mandate for our generation, and now more important than ever. And unfortunately, we have a young generation that did not experience those things, and frankly, is not really geared to the kind of activities that we saw over the last decades.
Okay, Malcolm, you're now the vice chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations. Can you, for those on the webinar who are less familiar, can you describe more about the organization? Because people were asking me before tonight, and I don't know if I answered it properly, so I'd like you to talk about it, if you don't mind.
Well, after 38 years there, I do have some idea of what they do, not completely. I still ask myself some of the questions, but I moved from being CEO to be vice chairman so that we could groom another generation of leadership. And I remain very involved and may spend much of my time still involved in the conference, as well as doing some other things. The conference is an umbrella organization created in 1956 at the insistence of John Foster Dulles, who said essentially that the Jews should get their act together. And he was tired of meeting with the 6 Jewish organizations that came to him periodically. And out of that came the President's Club. And in 1959, the Conference of Presidents with a dozen organizations. Today, 53 organizations covering the entire spectrum of Jewish life. It's the broadest umbrella of the Jewish community that includes everything from American Jewish Committee and AIPAC and ADL and the federations to the religious streams. And they sit around this common table, and they don't necessarily always agree, but I would say, well, more than 90% of the issues, we can find the common ground to act together. And it's in that unity that we have our strength. The conference deals with international and national issues. We don't deal with local issues and philanthropic. We don't do fundraising per se, except to try to keep the conference alive. But we do deal with the UN, terrorism, anti-Semitism, such a broad range of issues and challenges that we see today and that we have seen over the years. And I think we can look to a terrific track record of achievement because we bring everybody together, and that in our achdut, in our unity, lies our strength to recognize that the whole is far greater than the sum of the parts. That underlies the importance of the Conference of Presidents. As Rabin once told me when there were people sniping, and he said, if the conference didn't exist, I'd have to create you. And I think that that is true today as well. We need to come together. We have to create an atmosphere of respect so that differences can be discussed, but that the differences don't become the focus, but rather what we have in common.
Okay, great. So so let's talk about Iran, because everyone's focused on what's going on in Ukraine now. But what is going on? The little history, the Iran deal. Is it on? Is it off? I think Trump had stopped it. So what's the latest under the current administration?
Well, 2015, the JCPOA was adopted during the Obama years, and President Trump did exit from it. And now there are negotiations that have been ongoing for several months, supposedly coming to a conclusion soon, but we've been told that for months, and deadline after deadline passed when the United States said that it would withdraw from the negotiations if Iran didn't agree. And now we're still not at a point of conclusion. There are issues that have yet to be resolved, and there are many people who oppose it. We've seen leaders, Democratic leaders in the Senate, Senator Menendez, Senator Cardin, many others, 116 members of Congress who have come out and expressed deep concern about certain provisions, if not the overall deal, because it provides economic relief for Iran, perhaps tens of billions of dollars, maybe even $100 billion by some estimates. It allows for Iran to resume its, to sustain much of its program. It doesn't ask them to dismantle the infrastructure of their nuclear weapons program, but to essentially store it, which means that they can reactivate at any time. We know that they've been reaching up to 60% enrichment, 90% is weapon grades. We know that they have the IRG-6, which is the most advanced centrifuges, and even 7s and 8s in the coming on the way, that will enable them that as soon as they want to break out, it would be a matter of weeks, maximum months. But the biggest experts say that in 4 months, they would have 4 atomic weapons. All of this time in violation of Security Council resolutions, not just the deal, they have been testing ballistic missiles under the guise of a space program, but only to see that they could reach all the spots in the Middle East, and particularly one, as well as the United States ultimately. And they are working on the third part, which is weaponization. They have not mastered that yet, but that's a technical issue. And once you have the knowledge, you can tell them export the enriched uranium. It doesn't matter because they can replace it. You can't take away the knowledge and the experience that they have gained over these years in terms of developing a nuclear weapon. We've seen them also advance their conventional weapons. We see their support for the terrorism. And one of the conditions that the United States is saying is that they have to deactivate or lower the level of a lot of their subversive activities in the region in exchange for taking the Iran Revolutionary Guard off the foreign terrorist organization. That would be scandalous. And I think it's an opinion held by, I would say, probably a vast number of the members of the House and Senate and even members of the administration. Yet this is something that is being dangled to the Iranians, but they have to agree to lowering the profile of their subversive activities and not willing to do it. We also believe that they are, because of the price of oil going up, they are benefiting greatly by it. They exported $28 billion last year, and now with the price going up, it'll be much more. So the economic pressure is somewhat diminished, although their economy is in ruins. The unemployment among young people is over 40%. They had tens and tens of thousands of deaths that they didn't report from the COVID, far more, 10 times more than what they acknowledged by people I speak to in Tehran on a regular basis. They are involved, as you know, supporting the Houthis, attacking Saudi Arabia, attacking others, and of course, Hamas, Hezbollah, and many other terrorist organizations, including in South America. We are losing the whole continent of South America and Iran through its proxies, Venezuela and others, who we're talking about buying oil from, at the same time that we've been sanctioning them for buying oil from Iran. They are all over the world engaged in activities through various proxy groups like they have in Syria, like they have in Iraq, like they have in Lebanon. And they pose a global danger as well as a regional danger. And of course, their prime target is Israel, but also Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and many others. And to give them the resources to bail them out again, as we did once, without having hard and fast commitments that can be implemented. They did not allow the Atomic Energy Agency to investigate the sites. We know that they have hidden sites. We know that they rebuilt Natanz. It's 10 football fields long. We know that they have secret facilities, and the information that Israel took out of Tehran in that raid is still being studied and still guiding the inspectors, and the Iranians are blocking them. They've taken out the cameras. They broke virtually all the agreements that were made. So there's no reason to believe that this is going to be any different. The Russians are working with them both in Tehran and really carrying the negotiations in Vienna, which is quite remarkable at a time when we're trying to boycott them on every other front, but we're turning to them to lead in the negotiations. And they themselves said that Iran is getting far more than they ever anticipated they could get. So it's very hard to see what the benefits of this deal is, if it would really stop the nuclear program. But even if we agree to some measures being taken, if we are going to release IRGC from the sanctions, if we're going to not hold them on all the other sanctions we have in place for human rights violations, for terrorism, for other things, not just the JCPOA, we will unleash Iran in the region and pay a heavy price for it.
So are you currently advising the current administration? Are you currently engaged with them?
We talk to the administration regularly. We talk to other governments regularly. There are people in the administration who share our concerns. I think that they're not evil people. They're not bad people. They're actually, most of them, Blinken and Jake Sullivan and others, who are friendly and supportive. And I think that they are driven for this for a number of reasons. And some people actually do believe it. And I don't deny that there is some legitimacy on all sides to this. But the first thing they should do is submit it to Congress. Now they're saying they won't, but let Congress investigate it. Let them be a full hearing. Let there be a real examination of this so that you'll have confidence in whatever comes out. And with the timelines running out in 3 years, 5 years, Iran won't be restricted in any way. So we have to see what was promised originally, longer and stronger. What we're getting is weaker and shorter. So I think we have to not question the good faith of most of the people involved, but we have to look to the longer term. We've alienated our allies. You see that 4 Arab countries came out against it. You see the meeting in the Negev today of the foreign ministers from Arab countries, 5 Arab countries coming together. The meeting that took place in Egypt between Sisi, the head of the UAE, and Bennett. These are all being driven because of fear of Iran, about a sense that the West and the United States in particular is withdrawing from the region and lessening its commitment, and the focus shifting to South China, to China and overall. And while China is activating and increasing its activities in the Middle East as well, a withdrawal of an aircraft carrier by the US is seen by them as a lessening of our commitment, even if it is for technical reasons or something else. So we have to, number one, rebuild the relationships between the United States and the countries. We have to show them that we will stand by them. We just sent Patriot missiles to Saudi Arabia after withdrawing them because of the attacks by the Houthis, which have hit their oil depots, have hit their airports, have hit other places. Each of the countries faces challenges. UAE has been attacked. Egypt is always under siege from terrorists and entities, from ISIS, from Al-Qaeda, from others. And Iran is behind most of it. So we have to unite the countries in the region against Iran, that we have to show true American leadership, that we will stand by our allies, and that we will provide the necessary equipment for them to defend themselves. Israel just signed a deal with the US. But I suggest you look at the number of joint military exercises. There's one starting in Greece now, 9 countries with an additional 10 countries as observers. From India to Greece, they're coming there. We've seen it off the coast of Israel. We saw it recently in Cyprus, naval, air exercises, military exercises. These are not just hypothetical. It's because they realize and they face significant dangers in the region itself. And by unifying and by creating cooperative ventures and coordinated efforts, perhaps air defense, other things against terrorism and the threats that they face, we can see some good that is coming out of it. Certainly the Negev, the picture of the Negev summit should be a source of inspiration, and Secretary Blinken is there as well. I think he's going to get an earful from many of the countries there. But it's the Abraham Accords were a game changer. Now we have the sports and cultural festivities of the Abraham Accords. We need to build on it. We need to build the confidence. The US has helped on that, but we have to do much more and spread it further. We started the Greece-Cyprus-Israel alliance 13 years ago, and now you see how that has grown. The Mediterranean Initiative, that we can rightly credit ourselves with having been the first, as we were in the Gulf 25 years ago and 15 years ago and 10 years ago in Saudi Arabia. The American Jewish community, all of us can help play a role. Businessmen can help foster relationships. This is a time when we have to do it. They have to see the benefits of the accords, and we have to see America play, as they are, a very important role in advancing them and standing up against these forces of evil in the region.
So where does Iran play in what's going on? You mentioned Russia. So Russia is working with Iran from your assessment?
Absolutely. Russia is working with Iran. They're in Tehran, but they're also in Vienna. Their main advocate there, and fostering the ties. Remember that Russia has asked, as part of the deal, that they be exempted from the sanctions in their dealings with Iran, which means that they could sell their oil through Iran. They could sell other goods through Iran and bypass the sanctions that have been imposed on them. They're doing it now. China buys 3/4 of the oil that Iran exports, but Russia has been working with them as well and bypassing some of the restrictions that have been placed on them. You know, Russia signed a $10 billion deal to rehab the Bushehr nuclear reactor. And they're saying that that has to be exempt from any sanctions as well. So Russia, if there's a deal, they benefit. And if there's no deal, then you keep 2 million barrels a day off the market, and their price of oil, and Russia being the major exporter of oil, benefits as well. So the Russians are playing, as always, a duplicitous game in this region.
And you mentioned China. So how does China benefit from the situation?
So China benefits from every situation. China doesn't take sides. It takes interests. It pursues its interests. The first and foremost is energy. The Belt and Road Initiative that is expanding around the region, around the world, also in the Gulf. They've been active in the Gulf, building ports, establishing, making investments, whether in Iran and in Saudi Arabia and UAE at the same time. They play all sides. They're very clever. They have relationships with all the parties. You see them in Israel all the time, buying and investing. The Chinese are very entrepreneurial, but they're driven. Their economy is in real trouble right now. I think that the Belt and Road could be countered, but it would take concerted effort by all of the countries together. Right now, that is not the focus, and U.S. is focused on trying to prevent, them taking Taiwan, to doing other things. We have the India-China conflict. We have so many manifestations that, but yet when they persecute the Uyghurs, we see that the world is not willing to stand up to them.
So someone posted, a friend of mine posted in the chat, what can we do as American citizens to stop this Iran deal?
Call your congressmen, your senators, and tell them we want to make sure that the Congress gets a chance to review it, that they let the administration know their concerns about it. We don't want this to become a partisan issue. We want it to be both Republicans and Democrats. It should be about American security, about America's allies' security. And the more we get people to talk about it and write about it and ask people to learn about it, unfortunately, there's almost no discussion of it. One can disagree or agree with Netanyahu's going to Congress and angered a lot of people, even till now, Democrats and others. But the fact is, he forced a discussion. There was a debate. People were discussing it. Today, in part because you have Ukraine, you have other things that are overshadowing the issue, and it's been dragging on for so long that I think people don't necessarily pay attention to it. They don't have the attention span for it, but it is of such significance. I mean, what happens out of this deal could lead to a nuclear arms race with every country in the region, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, others, Turkey, all going nuclear, if Iran is going to be nuclear and have nuclear weapons capacity. So we have to get the message, educate the American people. There are talk shows, there are a lot of vehicles. I see on the shows that I do on CBS Eye on the World, the John Batchelor show, how people are now reacting. And when we do some of the shows about this and bring experts on, they say, how come we didn't know it? How come we haven't heard this? Well, people have to make the effort to learn the facts.
So let's talk about Israel. So what can Israel do? Should they just work through America, or is there an independent strategy that they can do to deal with Iran?
I think both. I think Israel has to do what it has to do, and it keeps saying it will do what it needs to do. It cannot tolerate a nuclear Iran. America, in fact, Secretary Blinken today again said, we will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. But even if we allow Iran to be a non-nuclear power where it can spread terrorism and violence, that too is very destructive. But I think Israel can't afford to be the second. It can't afford to sustain a nuclear attack. And we know that Iran has developed its drones and its missile capacity. It doesn't have much of an air force. Most of their planes are antiquated, but it has developed the ability of these of drones, and they have many thousands and thousands of them. As we saw, they attacked against Saudi Arabia and against UAE in a very tactically exemplary manner. So we have to take very seriously that. And Israel is developing all sorts of means to be able to react to it. Nobody wants to see a war. Nobody sane wants to see a war in the region with Iran, but also nobody who cares about the future of the region and way beyond the region can allow Iran to just move ahead with a nuclear program of this kind. So Israel, faces many burdens, and unfortunately, the world puts a lot of onus on Israel. Now they're even in the middle of the negotiations on Ukraine. Who would have thought that of all countries to be a mediator, that Israel, and I hope we can talk a minute about the Ukraine situation in Israel, because it's really getting an unfair bad rap on its response to this. So Israel on all fronts has to do what it has to do, both building the defense against it and building the offensive capacity to address it.
So talk about, Israel has gotten some very negative media recently. So tell us the role Israel is trying to play and why the media is, saying such bad things?
Well, I think this is very important because I hear it from many people in the Jewish community who fall victim to the fake news and misreporting and distortions. Israel's accepted already about 18,000 Ukrainians. That's 18,000 more than the United States and Great Britain. They have taken, and by the way, 2/3 of them are not Jewish. I was at the airport. I saw the Ukrainians coming and was in the middle of the night seeing a plane that Christians United for Israel paid for. That's Pastor Hagee, which is legitimate. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of missionary work by not legitimate groups, but he raised over $2 million in 2 weeks to give through the Jewish Agency to fly Jews out. 158 people came off the plane and not one suitcase. I told everybody, wait, they have to unload the plane. There was nothing to unload. It's only what people were carrying in bags. And of the 158, there were 20 men, mostly over 60, because they left their husbands, brothers, and sons, could not leave the country and are in the Ukraine today. So Israel has sent a hospital, a field hospital, 65 doctors from Israel, nurses, others, setting up maternity wards, x-ray things, a field hospital that is really expansive, beyond which they have sent in 100 tons in the first week of humanitarian goods. And since then, many, many more shipments of humanitarian goods, let alone countless amounts of money have gone from Israelis. There are about a dozen Israeli organizations working on the borders of the Ukraine in different countries, the Jewish Agency, certainly the JDC, certainly the Federation support them, many other organizations that have been doing remarkable work and people risking their lives. Israeli soldiers who have gone to work on the borders or even to volunteer, Ukrainians who are living in Israel. Israel has spent more, I think, per capita, probably than almost any country in developing this. Today, there were 8 armed ambulances that were sent in, the special rescue, to take out Holocaust survivors from the Ukraine, from inside Ukraine. Just today, 8, because I got the report a little while ago, taken out one at a time in these ambulances to Germany or to other borders where they could be treated and cared for. And food going in, all sorts of efforts along the border and inside the country to make sure that the resources are there and to aid people who want to leave, whether to Israel or to other countries. They don't discriminate. They try to aid everybody who wants to get out. And, even Arabs from the Palestinian areas or from Lebanon to Syria got out through the help of Israel. So this blame that people are putting, and even unfortunately President Zelensky in his speech made some references that I thought were very unfortunate, and put an onus on Israel, which is a small country, we have to remember, that is unfair. And we see major countries that haven't come close to doing what Israel has done.
So the current ambassador to Israel has made negative marks about Israel. What can we do to offset that?
Well, I think he made negative comments about settlements. I don't know that he made comments about Israel. I've known Tom Nides for 30 years. We fought many times. We have very different views on a lot of issues, but he's somebody who identifies, and I can say that since his time in Israel, seems to be identifying far more as a Jew visiting the Kotel, I think almost every day, he told me, because of a friend of his who was sick. He lit the menorah there during Hanukkah. He has done demonstrative things. He even went to Bnei Brak. I think he visited Rav Kanievsky Zatzal. He represents an administration. He has to be true to their policies. His own predilections, as he says, is I would say, more left of center. He's been critical of the settlements and sometimes used language, I think, that was not helpful in that regard. But he's also basically stood in support of Israel, has built close relationships with the people in the government. And, it is up to the US government to hold him to account for what he says. But you have to look at both sides of where he came down, and where he's wrong. We have absolutely every right to express our concerns with what he says.
So do you think, you think Israel really has the potential to potentially resolve the situation? Are you optimistic that Israel can play a very positive role going forward?
in the Ukraine situation?
Yes.
I think it can play a positive role. It won't play a negative role, but I don't see that Israel can implement a solution. I think that it can be a messenger carrying messages, help facilitate communications. Turkey is involved. Other countries are involved. Macron has been going back and forth. But it's really up to Putin. It's up to one man to make a decision that he wants to reach an accord. I think that we have to find a ladder for him to climb down on, but not one that sacrifices, I think, fundamental interests and the suffering, the effort to rebuild is going to take decades, I think, and the amount of money that will be involved will be astronomical. But right now we have to try to get the fighting to stop. Right now we have to put the pressure on the economic sanctions are taking a very heavy toll on the people in Russia. There is dissent growing inside the country. I think that he has sent signals that he is reorienting some of his activities, but there has to really be a cessation of violence. And I think Israel can help by providing advice and direction for ways that everybody can climb down and we get the killing and the firing to stop. It's really hard to watch. I don't think anybody can look at these daily pictures and not be really shaken by it, to see the children, to see the elderly people and the conditions that the country is in.
So Malcolm, I've heard you speak over the past decades about anti-Semitism, but first of all, I mean, have you ever seen anti-Semitism as high as it is today? Are you concerned that it's more widespread, or just people are just starting to wake up?
I think it's both. I think it is much more widespread, and it is spreading, and especially on our campuses amongst youth, it is being more tolerated in many places, and there is growing recognition. We have the IHRA definition, which is very important. It's been adopted by, I think, 36 states and many, many dozens of countries, universities, and others. It is critical because it's a way, it's a definition and it's a measure. It gives 18 examples, including anti-Zionism, that can be, people can be held to account, universities or governments or public officials, to account for what they say or even do by virtue of the IHRA definition. BDS is again raising its ugly head, and nobody should be deceived. It is anti-Semitism. Israel is the collective Jew today, that even if you can't say I hate Jews, you can say I hate Israel, but you know what they really mean. It doesn't mean you can't criticize a policy of Israel. It means that denying Israel's right to exist. It means taking the steps that we're seeing on campuses across the country. Lawsuits are critical. We see them from Brooklyn College to San Francisco State, where actions finally be taken. In most cases, universities do not act. They're not responsive to the needs of Jewish students. We have to train our students. We have to back them up. The Lawfare Project helps. Other organizations provide legal assistance, but communities have to be there in locus parentis to help students because they feel very isolated and very vulnerable. We see kids leaving universities because it's become intolerable for them because of anti-Semitism. Frank Luntz was doing a film with student leaders from API from across the country, 100 of them. And he told me that he asked them, and in a break that they were having just off the cuff, how many of you have experienced anti-Semitism? And 100 hands went up. And he said, no, I mean, you experienced it, not heard about it. 100 hands went up. And 94% of American Jews say that they are concerned and worried about anti-Semitism. More than half of American Jews say they've experienced it. We have a 400% increase in New York City in anti-Semitic attacks. These are not just verbal, there's physical assaults that are taking place. It's not just swastika daubings anymore. We see that our institutions come under assault and individuals virtually every day. And this is true across the country now. We have bomb threats against Jewish institutions. You have other kinds of manifestations, which I'm happy to discuss and we can go into. But the fact is that anti-Semitism is rising. It's becoming tolerated more and more, just as the resistance to it, that public officials will speak out, that law enforcement, and they all have to be held to account. Those who are opinion molders, those who shape the views of young people, entertainers, athletes, others have to be brought in to speak out. Those who can influence how they think, but it's also coming from the extreme left, from the extreme right, from Muslims, from minority groups. And it's a perfect storm today. And just as what we saw in Europe with the loss of the political center, with the rise of extremist groups translated into the political manifestations, political parties and the systems, we are seeing that here in the United States. And I warned about it many years ago, as you know, and I spoke about it even at Fifth Avenue Synagogue long ago, more than 10 years ago, saying, look at Europe, it's the model. It's what happens in England more than France, where it's top down. In France, it's usually bottom up, that we have to stand. And everything is interrelated. What happens domestically and internationally, the anti-Semitism is a pandemic today, and it crosses borders and oceans, and we have to learn from each other and work together. There's going to be an announcement of a very big grants from the American government to increase security grants to Jewish institutions, and people should take advantage of it. We have to train our people. We have to know how to respond. But I do want to give them, to say one thing. I don't hold people to account because they didn't jump about anti-Semitism years ago. When we say in the Haggadah, B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chalosenu, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky Zatzal once asked, do you mean every generation there wasn't one that didn't have it? He said, read the next paragraph where it says, Lavan bikesh la'akar hakol, that Lavan, Yaakov Avinu Jacob was living with his father-in-law. He thought his flocks were growing, his family was growing. He didn't like him and they had tension. But all that time, Lavan was plotting against him. So that the generations that don't see it visibly understand that there's always this thing boiling below the surface. And this is not an exaggerated reaction and fear-mongering. It's a reality. And anybody who doesn't understand it, go and look at the statistics. I have not yet seen one organization anymore that doesn't recognize it. And when overwhelmingly people in every survey and every study that we do tell us that they have experienced it, or somebody in their family directly experienced it, when we see it in corporate settings, when we see it in universities, when we see it in elementary schools and high schools, look at the number of cases around the country saying that even Holocaust denial in public institutions. So we all have to be on alert, but we have to say that the responsibility is not ours. We are the victims. We have to shift the responsibility to those who can make a difference. And in every sector, every opinion maker, every decider, from judges to courts, to schools, to universities, entertainers, as I said, others, anybody who's an opinion molder has an obligation to stand up. Just as we fight racism and bigotry in all forms, it has to today focus on anti-Semitism as well.
So what happened today in Turkey and the Gulf? Is something going on today or this week?
There's a lot going on. Turkey is going through this. Mr. Erdogan is a very mercurial fellow. I've met with him many times, and we have this very strange love-hate relationship that developed over the years. But right now he's in the love period where he is, as you know, they're suffering very much economically, and he feels under pressure, Russia, others, Iran. And so he's again turning to Israel. He hosted the president of Israel, President Herzog. He's talked about inviting Bennett to Israel, maybe even himself paying a visit, Bennett to visit Turkey, but he himself may be making a visit. But he feels very isolated, and his economic conditions inside the country are bad. There is growing opposition to him. He continues his war against the Kurds, which is unfortunate, but he is looking to Israel. I asked him once, why do you pay for all the riots on the Har Bayit, the Temple Mount? And he does pay for them. The Al-Aqsa under siege. And he said to me, how do you know? And we agreed that we both knew. And ultimately he said, look, you can't be the caliph without Jerusalem. So he has hegemonic views. He wants to reassert the Ottoman Empire, just like Iran wants to reassert the Persian Empire. But right now he recognizes, and because of his internal difficulties, that he reached out to Israel. The interesting thing is that through all this difficult period with Turkey, trade between Turkey and Israel never went down. It's a steady stream up because the people of Turkey wanted to maintain the relationships. There are 13 flights a day in the summer from Turkey to Israel. And anybody who's flown knows that Turkish Air is very popular amongst Jews around the world, flying to Israel and other places. And so the people of Turkey generally have been supportive. He has tried to introduce this Islamism. He is a Muslim Brotherhood supporter, and he still harbors Hamas in Istanbul, Hamas leaders. But right now there is a change, and we should work on it.
So let's talk, you mentioned a little bit, talk about the Abraham Accords as far as the continuity of it. So, do you feel like it's moving in the right direction? Have things stalled, or what's your
No,
assessment?
things have not stalled. Things are moving every day. There are conferences, tourism, 200,000 Israelis last year. It'll be much more. Look at the Pesach programs in the UAE. I think it's quite a remarkable statement. There are shuls now functioning, synagogues in 3 at least in Dubai. The government has been very open and receptive. They're going to open next year probably the Abrahamic Center, where you have a shul, a mosque, and a church, all of the same height, which will be functioning. They have reached out. We saw in Saudi Arabia where they are researching the areas where Jews live. And the Muhammad Ali said, the head of World Muslim League based in there, has reached out. He spoke at YU, he spoke many other places. At Bahrain, the same. You have to give them a lot of credit for it. Hopefully other countries, not just in the Gulf, but will reach out. The fact that they're there in the Negev, UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, and others, meeting Morocco, meeting together is a remarkable statement. It was unthinkable a year ago. And now Morocco also should be credited, and we should be supporting it. They also have Pesach programs there. But trade, there are delegations there every week. And when I was in Israel last week, 50 leading businessmen from Morocco were there, and they had the time of their lives. They negotiated deals. The potential is unlimited, and we can spread it. There are other Muslim countries, and I'm working now on one idea and one program, which I hope will able to unite what we did in the Mediterranean and the Gulf, the Abraham Accords, with a broader approach that can change the whole world. It changes the region, certainly, and you can build a continuity of peace from the Atlantic to the Pacific the long way.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Well, one thing people are not talking about, and I thought if anyone would know, so the current administration just pulled out of Afghanistan. What are the real repercussions? What's going on there? The media is not talking about it.
Nobody's talking about it, and it's still, the human tragedy remains. I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, but I believe that the message to a lot of the countries in the region was very negative when we pulled out the way we did. And I'm not saying it was wrong to pull out. I'm just saying it's often not what you do, but how you do it, and the messages that were communicated. When we canceled the East Med gas pipeline, the countries were not notified in advance. So maybe it was a wise decision financially, as they said, but the countries themselves felt put out and angry. So it's how you do things. And the message of Afghanistan to many in the region was not positive. And we need to show them that they can rely on the West, rely on the United States. I mean, I think Europe has proven itself to be a weak sister and not very reliable. But the United States is the key to all of this. And that's why we want to see our government strengthened. We want to see both the Republicans, Democrats, and Congress working together with the administration. We need everybody, all hands on deck now, to meet the challenges that we confront, both domestically, not only anti-Semitism, inflation, economic problems, also exacerbate internal tensions. There's so much to be done, and we need all to be in it to make it successful.
So you mentioned a little bit, but a little more deep. What's really going on with Saudi Arabia?
So Saudi Arabia is not yet ready to move into full negotiations, but there's a lot more going on. There are delegations going there, including Israelis and Jewish businessmen and others. The Saudis have visited Israel. It's not necessarily advertised. And I think the time will come. I don't think diplomatic relations is the trigger necessarily. It's something that could result. But I think right now we should expand all the relationships, all the connections, military, strategic, defense, security. There's a lot going on intel, intelligence sharing with Saudi Arabia, with many of the countries in the Gulf. And I think that we can create a framework where some of the countries that are not yet ready to make the leap towards full diplomatic relations will be able to join in common efforts.
So I was waiting for Mr. Lauder, but he must be tied up. But when he was on our Zoom a few weeks ago with Brooke, who you introduced, the two of them, he said there are about 400,000 Jews in the Ukraine when this first started. Do you have an idea how many have actually made Aliyah? How many are still left in the Ukraine? Do you have a good assessment of the numbers?
I think the general assessment is between 200,000 and 300,000 were there, though it's hard to know because many in small places and people who don't necessarily identify publicly as Jewish. As you know, 3-4 million people have left, maybe much more by now. There are probably more than 3 million just in Poland. But it's hard to decipher yet the number of Jews versus others. There are people who go to Israel, who want to go to Israel and identify themselves to the agencies, but those who want to stay, and a lot of them want to go back because they left their homes, they left everything, and I'm told that they're looted once they leave, and many of the houses have been destroyed. But people a lot of them want to go back. Some want to go to Germany, and Israel anticipates up to 100,000 people, but they're also coming from Russia now. There is an exodus from Russia because the circumstances there have also become more difficult. So I would say that you still have a very large number of Jews in the Ukraine. You have a large number in Moldova, in Poland, in Romania, in Hungary, and all the borders. And we have to do everything to make them comfortable there and to enable them to go to wherever they want, hopefully a lot to Israel.
So do you feel, Putin going after Ukraine has a direct effect on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or you don't see them directly related?
So it's an interesting question. There is a relationship. Obviously, the war in Ukraine impacts the whole region, impacts everybody, whether they see the ineptitude or if they see the failure to respond sufficiently, or if they see an overwhelming response from the West. It'll reassure people that they can rely on it as well. There are those who try to draw parallels to the Palestinians. There are no parallels. Israel didn't invade another state, and Israel didn't, launch a war like that against the Palestinians. It's just an inappropriate comparison. But I can't say that there won't be elevated concern in those who want to exploit every circumstance to criticize Israel and to attack Israel and to raise the Palestinian issues. Will do so. Right now, the Palestinians got to get to the table and negotiate. That's the key. Israel is ready, has proven itself ready over and over again. They are still assisting them. Look at the medical care. Look how many workers are coming into Israel. Again, stories that don't get told. And it's the resistance of Abbas, who doesn't face elections because he's in the 15th year of his 4-year term. And security cooperation does continue. And the United States helps facilitate that. So do others. And it's very critical to both sides that be sustained, especially now, as we saw the increase in terrorist attacks today in Hadera, a very terrible tragedy. That with Pesach and Ramadan and Easter coming at the same time, it's a perfect storm for and prescription for increased violence, as we have seen already. So they need to work together to make sure to protect the lives of everyone. And, Israel does so much more, again, than people realize. And yet when there is an incident involving Israeli Arabs, or when they behaved inappropriately, I think during the May war, when you saw the rioting in some of the mixed cities, it really undermines the confidence and the positive forces that exist. And I think that the leadership in the Israeli Arab community and in the Palestinian community have to take account. They see the other Arab countries coming to Israel. When the summit took place in Egypt, the Palestinian issue wasn't even raised. When I meet Arab leaders, they don't raise it. We raise it and ask questions about it. They don't, because they say we're tired of the kleptocracy. We're tired of pouring tens of billions of dollars into it, and it all goes into pockets. Look, resolving the issue is important. Peace is important for Israel. Israel wants it, has striven for it, and continues to strive for it.
So I'm going to invite the rabbi back to ask some questions, but I just wanted to ask this last question, which is twofold. So, David Friedman, they moved the Israeli consulate to Shalim. I'm sure you were there for that, which was a really amazing thing. But now there's discussion about a Palestinian consulate opening. So I want to know if you think that's real. And I also want to hear your thoughts on this, I don't know what to call them, this squad, this anti-Israel group in the Congress. You've been around for 4 decades. Have we ever had such bad people, with such bad intentions on the inside, and what's your perspective on that?
Almost 6 decades, and I've seen many evil people. So let's take both questions about the squad. What was the first question you asked them?
First one is, do you really think the Palestinian consulate, is that real? Or?
Oh, no, it's very real, and the administration is still pushing it. That was one of their pledges, but the Israeli government refuses to, and they have to give permission for it. There's no reason why it can't be in Ramallah or it can't be someplace else on the outskirts of Jerusalem, areas that Israel doesn't consider Jerusalem. There are ways to resolve it if they want to, but right now the pressure still seems to be on. But I think the administration has stepped back from it, but it's still on the agenda. Obviously, Israel sees it as a challenge. And when the United States policy under Trump was announced to be unified Jerusalem, that was the law passed in 1995 by Congress. And Yitzhak Rabin, in response to a request I made when we in Moynihan worked literally to get this passed through the Congress, and the President Clinton allowed it to become law. And every 6 months they waived it until President Trump didn't waive it anymore and declared United Jerusalem the capital of Israel. Now to introduce the Palestinian, a consulate for the Palestinians there is seen by many as undermining that. It's definitely still on the agenda. On the squad, it's a very important question. And, I saw something that really made me think a lot about it today. Richie Torres, who's this amazing member of Congress, Hispanic from the Bronx, very pro-Israel, leftist, but beat his Democratic Socialist opponent, the only case I think in New York of somebody who won. And he is avowedly pro-Israel. I mean, he speaks about it all the time. He's 34 years old, I think. And he gave a speech recently where he said that the Jewish community can't afford to lull ourselves into a false sense of security. And he said, when you celebrate the fact that only 9 votes were against the Iron Dome, he said 9 could become 90 in 5 years. And he gave an interview where he sought to engage his progressive colleagues about the vote. And he said a majority of Americans are persuadable on the issue and urging us to do much more, to stand out. And he was one of those who benefited from the trips to Israel that are done by the community, I guess JCRC or others. And we also have America's Voices, where we try to take key opinion molders. I was in Israel when the Democrats, AIPAC, brought groups of Democratic and Republican members of Congress. It's critical because the best thing that sells Israel is Israel, and our strongest weapon is the truth. The problem is that much of our media does not allow the truth about Israel to get out. It's distorted, it's misrepresented. And, Mark Twain said well over 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that if you don't read a newspaper, you're ill-informed. If you read a newspaper, you're misinformed. Today, much of the media misinforms us. And this is not, this is not meant to be critical of all the fake news syndrome. There is fake news, though. We see things I was directly involved in, and I can't believe them when I see the reports, how distorted it is. And for Israel to get a fair shake, as we saw during the war in May, when 4,000 rockets fall on Israel, and Israel's put on the defensive. No other country in the world would be measured by that standard, and the terrorism, et cetera. And Torres actually cited the war in May as being, I think he said, draining and challenging, that even his own mother questioned him about his views. So we have to do much more. We have to reach out to our members of Congress and all of you. Invite them to your synagogues, invite them to your communities, invite them for a Shabbat dinner, talk to them. Most of them don't know. We assume they know. A senator called me this week, I won't say who it was, but asked me about, something on Ukraine. And I turned to the issue of Iran and raised about the FTO and, foreign trade designation for the IRGC. And the senator had no idea about it. Now, it turns out material was sent to their office, but unless you call their attention to it, they have so many things pulling at them that it's the squeaky wheel theory. If you make the noise, you get the attention. Do it responsibly. We've got to do it effectively. We have a lot of issues today, and we have to advocate them. We have to build a generation to come, the next generation, that they will be willing to stand up, speak out, but they have to be knowledgeable to do it.
And you're educating us. Thank you. Rabbi Babbage. Rabbi?
Yes, Malcolm, thank you so much for your time this evening. And we commend you and thank you for your dedication to the Jewish community, to the state of Israel. I did have a couple of questions for you. You mentioned that you have spoken to the current administration about the New Deal. In your opinion, how receptive are they to hearing the feedback of the Jewish community and the concerns of the state of Israel? Is it lip service, or are they really trying to cater to the needs that are brought up? That's question number one.
You know, it's very hard to get into people's minds, or their hearts even, to know what they truly feel. They certainly are open to hearing from us, and to I think many of them share concerns that we have. Many people in the administration, you notice that 4 people, I think now, resigned from Rob Malley's team in the negotiations in Vienna because they could not tolerate the concessions that were being made. And one of them, the lead, is going to be retained by the administration in another position. So they're hearing it, and they don't ignore it, and they certainly don't ignore the Jewish community. There are many Jews in key positions, which doesn't necessarily mean good or bad. It depends on the individual. But I think that making our voices heard matters. Going to members of Congress matters. Jews are disproportionately involved in many campaigns, and politically and financially in other ways. But we should use that as intelligently and responsibly to leverage to get them to understand what our concerns are, because these should be concerns for America. These are not unique to us. And nuclear Iran is a threat to all of America's interests globally and here. Now, when they're developing hypersonic missiles, which will be able to deliver those kind of weapons to the United States as well. So this is an American concern, and we should present it as such.
Thank you. So to me, I'm no expert on the topic, but to me, one of the biggest flaws of the original Iran deal was that after a certain amount of time, I think it was 10 years, all limitations, all restrictions were lifted. And if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, that when the Obama administration was asked about this, the response was, but that gives us 10 years to normalize relations. We could talk with them, we'll convince them, we'll develop a rapport with them. So when this question, and you mentioned earlier that there is going to be a endpoint for whatever the restrictions are, at which point the country Iran is free to make a nuclear weapon. When the current administration, the Biden administration, is asked about this, and it doesn't sound like it's it's 100 years away, how do they respond? Because to me, this is the most obvious problem with all these deals.
Well, I referenced it earlier about stronger and longer, and the promise was to try and get to extend the sunset clauses, which are coming up very close. The first in 3 years, and 7 years, 8 years, and in 10 years, it'll all be bottle anyway, because all of the sunset clauses will come into effect in a very short time. You know, and it's a blink of an eye. People said 7 years, 8 years, it passes right away, and we're already facing that reality now. So the sunset clauses are a critical factor. If they had negotiated a deal that would really extend all of these deadlines much longer, that would have been a positive selling point for people. So far, we have not seen that is included. And what we're negotiating now is not the real deal, it's the preliminary to the deal. But in that stage alone, they could get billions of dollars, which will go into supporting terrorism. It doesn't go to the people. That 40% of the economy is controlled by the supreme leader and by the IRGC. Half of the country is in a drought. The unemployment amongst college graduates is about 50%. And they lopped 4 zeros off their currency. Can you imagine if somebody had $50,000, had $5? And yet the people are willing to put up with the sanctions and things if it will bring about a change, if this oppressive government was removed from them. And I believe that the answer is not in a war, which we don't want, but from the people. We should be supporting the Iranian people. That's the answer. They know what democracy is. They went into the streets in the hundreds of thousands yelling, "We will not die for Gaza. We will not die for Hezbollah, we will die for Iran. And the secretaries of state, both a Democrat and a Republican in the United States, when it happened twice, and they were in dozens of cities across Iran, got up and said, we don't get involved in family feuds and internal factors. And we killed it. They said, we're dying for this, and you don't even care. You tell us that we're on our own. And, you know, the Green Revolution and others, we had opportunities to do it. So I really believe we have to do much more to invest in the people, to provide them with the wherewithal to be able to act. And, you know, that Iran, more than 50% of the population are not Farsi. There's 30 million Azeris and Baluchis and many others. And the government doesn't have the same control of them. They try. But you remember when they massed on the border of Azerbaijan, the Azeris started to act up and they quickly backed off. So Iran is not impervious to the pressures that can be brought to bear on it. And I think that's the game. That's the way to isolate them and to continue to build the internal pressure and the external pressure on it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So Malcolm, we really appreciate what you do for the Jewish people, but we really are very grateful for your time this evening. And Mazel tov on your new presidency in Israel.
No, I'm not president of Israel, just the Jews in Great Synagogue. And
well, it actually will be easier, but
right.
but
he gets a better house with the deal.
But we're renovating the building, and we're going to book you. You have to bring your wife for Shabbos this time. That's the deal. But we're looking forward to having you. Shame last time, I guess you'll come again. So we have to.
I had the pleasure of being with Chazan Malavani in Babi Yar for the 80th anniversary just a few months ago, but it seems like it was decades ago when he sang. It was amazing. The Kaddish at the Babi Yar Memorial, the International Memorial.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. So, but we look forward to your coming back this winter, and we'll schedule it. And thank you so much for all your insightful, discussion this evening. Thank you so much.
And next time we'll have only good news.
Amen.
Remember that Israel is the 9th happiest country in the world. Who would have thought?
Should be the first. Good night. Good night.